It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this opening session of what is now the 17th in a series of seminars, the Building Bridges seminars, which were initiated by the Archbishop of Canterbury in 2002 and which have continued since. In 2005, we were hosted here by the Muslim, Catholic and Orthodox communities, and we discussed the question of the common good. And it's wonderful for us to be back here again with the hospitality of the three communities to pursue another question, the question of inequality. Our title this year is A World of Inequalities, Muslim and Christian Perspectives. I'd like to acknowledge some of our important, well, I was going to call them guests, but really they're hosts. We are the guests. This evening, Dr. Mustafa Ceric, who's the former Grand Mufti, who hosted us here in 2005. Professor Father Matozorkic, who participated 2 years in the Building Bridges seminar in Washington in 2004 and again here in 2005. Also Professor Enes Karic was there in 2004. Also to acknowledge the presence of Professor Władysław Topolowicz, who is the Dean of the Orthodox Theology faculty, who have graciously co-sponsored with the other two faculties. Professor Zuhdija Hasanovic, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Islamic Studies. Thank you for your welcome. And thank you to all of you. Many of you I know are students, and it's a delight for us always to, though we meet students, or all of us here are professors in one way or another, and we meet students on a day-by-day basis. But it's very interesting for us to have the opportunity to meet students, many of whom know our work from books and so on. And it's a great pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming to join us this afternoon. This seminar is perhaps the longest running, almost certainly the longest running international Muslim-Christian dialogue currently existing. It has a very particular style of work. This is not an academic conference in the ordinary sense, where we call experts to give papers, and people turn up sometimes and sometimes not. This is it's the building of a community. Over these 17 years, we have developed a network of Muslim and Christian scholars who are prepared to sit together over several days to study our scriptures together, to consider particular questions that are important to our world, always in the light of the canonical texts of our traditions. We don't come to this as we would normally in a conference to present our thinking. We come here to learn together, and to learn how to learn together. And so don't be surprised if you turn up on Friday afternoon and we still haven't resolved the problem of inequality in the world. What we will have done, I hope, is learned better how our own communities are involved with this, both as parts of the solution and indeed as parts of the problem. I said before that when we met here in 2005, we took the topic, the common good. And you'll find downstairs the record of that meeting. Indeed, you'll find the record of 16 of our 17 meetings. So those are available, and their details will be provided to you how you can have those books for free by PDF. But do please have a look at the results. But you'll see that mostly we take a positive topic. This year we've taken the topic of inequality, not because we think we can solve it, but probably because there is more agreement about the fact that there is great inequality in our world than there is agreement about whether there ought to be equality. If one reads current debates among political philosophers, ethicists, theologians, there is no general agreement precisely on the nature of equality and how it is to be achieved and whether indeed it's a good thing. But what we can all agree on, and what we all experience in our different ways, the reality of inequality. And these inequalities create a kind of tapestry together. They are not distinct inequalities. So we have political inequalities, racial inequalities, gender inequalities, economic inequalities, equalities born of ethnicity and nationalism, inequalities based on difference of religious belief, and these, just to name a few. So what we hope to do in this seminar is to immerse ourselves initially in the reality of inequality in this world, and to ask ourselves the question, how is it that we, Muslims and Christians, as such a substantial percentage of the world's population, how is it that, A, we have not succeeded in putting our vision of the world, the vision we believe God has given us of the world, how is it we have failed to live up to the ideals given to us by God? And how, indeed, is it possible that we, in fact, have participated in creating further inequality, in sustaining inequalities which were originally born of political and cultural and economic causes? So, you see, we have our work cut out for us. But, as always, our work, we hope, will be a pleasure. We begin this evening by having two keynote speakers, one from the Christian tradition, one from the Muslim tradition, who will lay out for us the question of inequality. And you'll find their biographies in your program. The first speaker is Dr. Ovamir Anjum, who is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at University of Toledo in Ohio in the USA. His work focuses on the nexus of theology, politics, and law in classical and medieval Islam. He's a prolific writer and translator, and I leave you to read further details about Dr. Anjum's work in your program. Our second speaker I will introduce after Dr. Anjum has spoken to us.
Thank you very much, Father Madigan, and thank you all for being here. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. Bismillah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of God, most compassionate, always compassionate. I've been asked to offer a diagnosis of the challenges of the many inequalities that afflict our world. I shall therefore reflect on the challenges and paradoxes rather than attempt to articulate cures. Let me begin by stating that Muslims have often failed to uphold the teachings of justice and compassion to which God has called us. Through, that is, to the teachings of his beloved Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace and blessings, by calling the Prophet Muhammad Rahmatan lil Alameen, Rahmah to all the worlds. One of my students taught me that Rahmah is not fully captured by its common English translation, mercy, as the latter connotes primarily forgiveness for the guilty. A better alternative is compassion, which emphasizes the concern for the weak, which is what we are in the eyes of God. As a community of God called to compassion and justice, we have a long way to go. It goes without saying that Muslim states in the world today suffer from most grievous injustices, many of which are self-inflicted. My relevant claim here is that these injustices are inflicted and sustained not in spite of the normative cultures, but as a result of them. These normative cultures, diverse as they may be, are in varying degrees informed by Islamic tradition, which therefore must be our point of departure, as I argue, for a critical understanding of and remedy for grievous inequalities. Equally evident, however, is the fact that as economically peripheral peoples of the world, Muslims' biggest sin appears to be weakness. From colonialism to neoliberalism, foreign forces have contributed to the destruction of traditional Muslim institutions, which has wrought incalculable damage to the Muslims' ability to confront the tremendously rapid economic and social transformations that have ensued, and have left us with a deeply defensive posture of fearful conservatism rather than a principled critique of and engagement with them. But this material and structural analysis offers only a partial explanation to us believers, to whom God can do all things if we keep our promise to him. And therefore, seeing all problems ultimately in moral terms is part of our faith. Yet, often this recognition of our own failures turns into a spiritualized fatalism and abdication of responsibility, which I believe can be averted through a critical appraisal of the problem at hand. Let me proceed to share a couple of profound paradoxes of our time that should concern any thinking about religion and inequality, in my view. First, there is the obvious paradox of religion and inequality in the modern world, one that is not unique to Islam. The data show, as it does not take too much imagination to heuristically confirm, what the opening lines of a recent volume on the subject claims. Quote, religion is one of the strongest and most persistent correlates of social and economic inequalities, unquote. Research in Western Christianity and Indian Hinduism, for instance, shows that the rise in religiosity as neoliberalism increases inequality, and the results are confirmed by trends in Western Europe. Although I'm not aware of research focusing on Muslim-majority countries, I suspect that the conclusions would be comparable. This phenomenon is explained either through the relative power theory, that is, the rich support religion for a number of reasons, and their support for it attracts the poor. Religion may also contribute to inequality by deflating pressures for redistribution. Or the less favored deprivation theory, which is religion provides comfort to the economically disadvantaged. Another alternative explanation may be that the success of the modern state as the agency of redistribution and management leads to a declining role of religion in small, modernized, homogeneous societies, leading to declining social relevance of religion. This dovetails well with the notion that many anthropologists have posited that the modern state is inherently secular and secularizing agent. Regardless, it seems clear that the religious intelligentsia have much to worry about, whereas our normative traditions call for renunciation of material wealth and otherworldliness that should presumably mitigate inequalities. Their effective impact in the modern world may be quite the opposite. The second paradox is the curious relationship between the left liberal demand for total and uncompromising equality in exactly the same age and encouraged by the same forces of neoliberalism that have generated some of the greatest inequalities and injustices of our time, and in fact have resurrected the radical right. A third paradox is one of definitions, and Muslims are often called to hurry up and imitate before the next wave of definitions hits. Injustice or unjust inequality, no doubt, is at the heart of some of the key issues the world is facing today, crises where Muslims are in the eye of the storm. As victims as well as perpetrators, Muslims are violently confronted with the question of injustice. Yet a settlement of what constitutes justice remains elusive, as modern aspirations are deeply chimerical. How radically these definitions and aspirations change from one decade to the next in our age of accelerated change can be appreciated if we trace the transformation of justice debates over the last couple of decades, from the equality versus freedom debate of the Cold War to the near triumph of individualism and capitalism in the post-Cold War neoliberal age, when the crucial question now becomes one of personal freedoms, personal sexual choice, gender pronouns, gender pay gap, and so on. These changing norms are not primarily the result of some nefarious conspiracy. Nevertheless, in this drama, the Anglo-American economic and political swings have been inordinately influential in deciding for the global cosmopolitan culture what justice ought to mean and what kinds of inequalities are worth opposing and which ones are inevitable, tolerable, and even desirable. More precisely, even as the notion of justice has, in the modern period, been equated to the notion of equality, yet the progressive liberals possess no moral criterion to differentiate between tolerable and intolerable inequalities, thus letting the market force and brute power to silently draw lines in the sand. Like hierarchy, equality comes with costs. The rise of liberal democratic equality has been accompanied by, if not facilitated, modern individualism and has greatly eroded familial and communal forms of life. Institutions our religious traditions consider crucial for religious life. The resurrection of the new far right to prominence across the West indicates the anemic state of these institutions. Allow me now to turn to Islamic scripture for inspiration and some thoughts. First, justice and mercy. The Quran calls us to be just first and foremost in the most intimate sense, even against ourselves and our kith and kin, as in Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 135, O ye who believe, be ye staunch in justice, witnesses for Allah, even though it be against yourself or your parents. Elsewhere, a similar verse emphasizes justice even against your enemy. But justice is still second to the virtue that we are most frequently reminded of in the Quran, that of rahmah, that is mercy and compassion. Now, in contrast to justice, which is al-adl, and fairness or equal distribution, al-qist, or rahmah, mercy, compassion, plain equality, one might translate that as musawat, is a concept that does not find direct expression in the Quran, nor is it a cardinal virtue in an unqualified sense. Nobility, we're told in the Quran, draws on one's piety. But piety nonetheless creates a kind of inequality. We are taught in Surah Al-Hujurat 49, verse 13, O people, lo, we have created you from a male and a female, and have made you nations and tribes, that ye may know one another. Lo, the noblest of you in the sight of Allah is the most pious. Here the import is to reject inequality based on race, tribe, and lineage. Yet even here a criterion for inequality is posited, namely taqwa. Nobility and quest for it is not absent, but it comes from piety and fear of God. Let me remark on a few different kinds of inequality apart from that of piety and admission of truth, faith, which is the first sort of criterion of inequality. Gender inequality. Men and women are, according to the Quran, allies and partners of each other, awliya. The Quran posits no difference in their religious status, aspirations, and virtues, and strongly suggests equality in these respects. In Surah 33, verse 35, we read, for Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for truthful men and women, and you go on through a list of attributes in which both men and women are emphasized explicitly as equal before God in attaining and being rewarded for these virtues. The Quran also conspicuously notes that in the story of creation, both Adam and Eve ate the tree and both were forgiven. The Quran goes out of its way to use a dual verb form to emphasize this point, as in Surah Taha, verse 121. Yet some hadith accounts seem to give a different bent to this story and reproduce the biblical narrative. One hadith also suggests, at least in a superficial sense, that women are deficient in religion and intellect, and this is in Bukhari. When discussing the marital institution, however, the Quran unequivocally declares that women have rights similar to those of men, yet men have a degree above them, in chapter 2, verse 228. And, quote, men have authority over women owing to what they spend on them and owing to God's grace to some over others. That's the famous 4:34 verse. Surah An-Nisa, verse 34. The same verse allows men to discipline their disobedient wives by warning, abandoning them in beds, and even striking them. The hadith reports express the Prophet's disliking of striking and qualify that permission by prohibiting the striking of face or striking so hard that it leaves a mark. The Quran also limits polygamy to 4 wives. If a man can be just among them, if he cannot, then only one. The women's share in inheritance, in itself a radical move, as women had hitherto been deemed property rather than property owners, is nonetheless half that of men in most classes of heirs. The Quran also deems one man's testimony equivalent to that of 2 women in certain cases. The juristic tradition received this Quranic model more or less faithfully. Yet its attempt to formalize and standardize sometimes accentuated the inequality more than what Scripture allowed, and on occasions in obvious contradiction to the prophetic teachings. Careful readers of the Quran, even in the pre-modern period, found this problematic. Some, for instance, noted that women were religious equals of men, and that the hadiths suggesting deficiency of women was, in fact, a reference to the particular issue that menstruating women may not pray or fast. The Prophet, in other words, was using this fact only rhetorically to perhaps encourage them to be more generous in a fundraising than men. And that this testimony, their testimony was deemed half only in the special cases of certain transactions and so on. A remarkable verse in the Quran, just before 4:34, however, anticipates the reaction one might have in response to the inequality that is posited. This is verse 32 in chapter 4. And wish not the thing in which Allah hath made you, some of you excel others. Unto men a share from what they have earned, and unto women a share from that which they have earned. But ask Allah of His bounty. Lo, Allah is ever knower of all things. In contrast to these verses that establish a social hierarchy, along with spiritual equality, most other Quranic verses addressing women are dedicated to warning men against abusing the authority that they're given in matters of marriage, divorce, and custody. Wealth inequality. Unlike gender inequality at the social level, which is carefully justified and regulated, economic inequality is treated in the Quran as undesirable, yet one that is to an extent unavoidable. Moreover, a number of means are devised to mitigate it. Inequality in wealth is tolerated only as a natural result of divinely ordained diversity of human circumstances. God gives some more than others, but only to test them, and vehemently denies any superiority on that basis. Yet, if one posits the human invention of private property as a foundation of all later inequality, and later even capitalism, as leftist historians do, then that foundation is remarkably preserved in the Quran. The right to own and freely engage in trade is unequivocally preserved, and theft is severely punished. Islamic law thus created a strong free market and private property, which engendered worldwide trade networks spanning in particular the Indian Ocean world, yet prevented the rise of modern form of capitalism. One can say something similar about inequality in slavery, but I'll leave that to my colleague Jonathan Brown to talk about. In summary, two observations can be made about the Quranic responses to these various kinds of inequality. First, in the categories of inequality that I have mentioned, we note a slight gradation. Faith, where inequality is imperative and required. Gender, where it's legally mandated but mitigated. Property and status, it's tolerated but highly mitigated. And finally, race, ethnicity, and tribe and language, where it's categorically rejected. Second, in responding to nearly all types of inequality within the community of the faithful, gender, wealth, and status, the Quranic response follows a pattern. The baseline of the Quran seems to be to accept the form of life that had emerged in nearly all major civilizations, and the Near East in particular, over millennia. This included descriptive and social institutions, family, clan, tribe, private property, patriarchy. They're adopted in a more or less modified form. Depending on one's focus, one may emphasize one or the other, whether how they're accepted, how much or they're modified, but both elements of acceptance and modification are undeniable. There was neither a total rejection nor total acceptance. Finally, in all these dimensions, it is Islamic law, the Sharia, that emerged as the site of management and mitigation of hierarchy and inequality. Let me now say a few things about inequality as a concept. I have qualified the kind of inequality maintained in Islamic law as hierarchical inequality. This suggests the question of what other kinds of inequality might there be. At a very rudimentary level, we can identify three kinds of inequality. There is the hierarchical inequality, which serves a social function and is justified by the normative order. It is here that the tensions between Islam and the modern liberal discourse on human rights lie, which I shall accept as the point of reference, that is liberalism, as a point of reference that is predominant in our time. Then there is the second kind of inequality, the might is right inequality, which is against accepted legal norms, where certain groups are above the law. Prohibition against this happens to be an area of overall agreement between the two traditions, Islam and liberalism. And finally, there is the outcome inequality, seen as necessarily a result of liberty in classical liberalism and capitalism, and its contemporary Republican version. But in both modern left liberalism and in Islam, it is seen as the object of mitigative action, meaning that, yes, if you engage in free trade, you will have winners and losers, but Islam as well as modern left are concerned with how to mitigate that inequality. The site and nature of these mitigative actions, however, differ. Left liberalism functions largely through the secular redistributive state in a top-down fashion, Islam largely through family, community, and religious law in a bottom-up fashion. Another underlying, one could say, metaphysical difference between Islamic scriptural and left liberal prescriptions and aspirations in mitigating inequality is in their respective attitudes toward nature. The natural order is seen as divine, and the Quran requires respecting it. That goes for all kinds of differences, wealth, gender, whereas contemporary left liberalism demands the intervention of state, court decisions, technology, and so on to mitigate the natural differences. This is evident in economic as well as gender inequality. Unable to offer a history or genealogy of the concept of inequality here, I will only broach some important questions that must be kept in mind when confronting scripture or tradition with this challenge. First, in nature and in human society, inequality is the norm. Whether it's the prides of lions, packs of wolves, or gangs of primates, or the struggle for dominance. The struggle for dominance is part of the animal kingdom. Among humans, similarly, no civilized society has survived without hierarchy, as far as we know. Even the precious few human groups that the anthropologist first thought lacked social hierarchy, such as the primitive tribes of the Andamanese in the Indian Ocean or the Sudanese Nur, live as clans with hierarchy of gender and age. The remarkable idea of the equality of all humans can be credited in the known history to the Abrahamic tradition, in which God made life sacred and human beings special. Ironically then, Christians and Muslims are gathered here today to address a problem that is entirely the creation of their belief in God, although in its secularized popular form it appears as a self-evident belief in no need for a justification. If God did not create us special, there is nothing in nature that indicates that we are either special or equal to each other in any way. The Quran, as we know, when emphasizing the special nature of human soul, references the older laws. For that cause we decreed for the children of Israel that whoever killeth a human being for other than manslaughter or corruption in the earth, it shall be as if he had killed all mankind, and whoso saveth the life of one, it shall be as if he had saved the life of all mankind. Second, the concern for socio-political equality in its current form as being among the highest moral goods is a distinctively modern and particular liberal concern, and is difficult to imagine without the prior rise and establishment of a few fundamental beliefs, one being individualism and another being secularism, because such a conception requires discounting the settling of scores and righting of wrongs in an afterlife. All equality has to materialize in this life, as well as any kind of religious fatalism, in which one simply gives in to God's will. In other words, liberalism has had to disavow or deny its religious roots in order to arrive at the current form of individual equality as the ultimate good, in need neither of justification nor balancing with other potentially more important goods. We would have to also to ask, how is it that modern liberal political and economic systems have produced and entrenched such tremendous inequality in the world? Might there be something profoundly questionable about the Pollyannish demand for equality at the expense of all other goods, and might the concept of equality itself need rethinking? Such an inquiry would have to confront the fact that different moral traditions respond to different classes of inequality differently. As Catholic philosopher, MacIntyre's classic Which Rationality, Whose Justice reminds us. Such an inquiry would have to confront the kinds of questions Lisa Abou-Lughod does in her book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving?, that demonstrates the colonialist and imperialist underpinnings of even the seemingly most well-meaning liberal demands for gender equality in Muslim countries. Islamic history has had its own complex history of toying with radical egalitarianism. The early Islamic egalitarians, the Kharijites, violently sought equality at a practical and at a political and religious level, and their anarchism violently led to their extinction and predictably cooled the ardor for their ideas among the Muslim mainstream. Another early movement that did succeed, the Abbasids, was fueled largely by the non-Arabs' desire for equality with the Arab Muslims. Both of these movements for relative equality were violent, like the French Revolution. Equality is a powerful idea that has often unleashed carnage. The American Revolution, with its noble self-evident truth that all men are created equal and are possessed of certain inalienable rights, those of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, while successful in avoiding the immediate carnage, was in fact part of a colonial project enabled by mass killings and perhaps the worst kind of enslavement in recent history, and one that sought to protect the propertied class of men. We may cautiously venture, therefore, that no instance of demand or granting of radical equality has been innocent and none has been total. Now, modern Muslim responses to the question. I will simply offer a classification, the progressive versus the traditionalists on this question, and of progressives who on the whole reject the traditional answers of the jurisprudence that is built on the text that I've recited. I propose to divide them further into two kinds: a weak progressivist thesis, some may call them reformists, who reinterpret the scriptural texts to arrive at or more or less liberal solutions, and in the process recruit classical tradition without being bound by it. And then there are strong progressivists who reject parts of the scripture explicitly using different strategies. Some reject Medinan surahs that spoke of laws and norms in favor of Meccan surahs that generally emphasize beliefs and ethics. Others abstract general principles such as monotheism and justice and argue that these require the rejection of the particular teachings of the Quran and Hadith. So take the general, leave the particular. The attempts can, so I'll just leave it at that. And then the traditionalists, namely those who take Islamic discursive tradition as largely probative and authoritative, are a camp too large and internally diverse to adequately characterize through a single hermeneutic. They have often rejected the absolute imperative of equality and reformulated it as a question of equity and justice, not equality. Some adopt a theology of anti-modernity, others embrace obscurantism, that is, sanctification of tradition and unwillingness to systematically reevaluate it, and yet others, fideism. Even though my own sympathies lies in this camp, as I see seeds of the most compelling scriptural and moral reasoning in this camp, the traditionalists have yet to offer a widely persuasive account of how old and new structural injustices, let alone inequalities, can be remedied. Part of the reason, I suppose, is that the pre-modern tradition saw injustice as primarily an individual sin or its accumulated result. The social and political institutions of pre-modern Islam have been largely those of the agrarianate empires that gradually evolved in the region over millennia, and medieval jurisprudence largely took them for granted. In contrast to the rapid structural ruptures introduced by modern revolutions and the development of large-scale associations of bureaucracy, military, and business corporation, the tradition relied on sort of inherited stabilities. Modern injustices and inequalities immanent in such structures, therefore, cannot easily be arrested through pre-modern traditional ethics. On the one hand, as Catholic philosopher Alistair MacIntyre powerfully observes, modern secular ideologies have produced no epistemic or ethical consensus, making our ethical language as well as aspirations little more than hangovers from an earlier age. So while there are no compelling reasons for why we ought to seek equality or justice or virtue if there is no God, we continue to speak as if we ought to. This is why reinvigorating tradition may be the only viable alternative for ethical thinking and practices. On the other hand, traditionalism can be escape from responsibility. To Muslims, this imposes the enormous challenge of sifting through competing strands of tradition as well as varying accounts of modernity, reconciling the will of God as revealed in Scripture with that as revealed in history. Looking ahead, if inequality in itself is not an absolute injustice or one that is exorable, we must focus our attention to kinds of inequalities that are unjust and are curable. The vast majority of gratuitous human suffering inflicted on others is of this kind. A word about the kinds of injustices that can no longer be mitigated, yet they invite reflection on God's infinite wisdom, even anticipation of miraculous redemption. One among them is environmental degradation. All the fruits of industrialization over the last 2 centuries, the phenomenon that is single-handedly responsible for the coming apocalypse, environmental apocalypse, have been reaped by the Atlantic world. Yet its most devastated consequences are being visited upon those poor who barely ever enjoyed a bite of that apple, who have been at the receiving end of colonialism and imperialism, and whose carbon footprint is invisible among the giants. Yet, if you look at the map, the areas with the least carbon footprint are also the first ones to be rendered uninhabitable by global warming and flooding and rising sea levels. These include nearly 1 billion people in low-lying coastal areas of Pakistan, Egypt, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, and the like. God has put the fate of most densely populated Muslim areas of Muslim majorities in the hands of those who have consumed the oceans and scorched the earth, yet they deny not only their guilt, but that there has been a murder. I will now mention some of the ways in which deep and unjust inequalities have been tolerated and or celebrated for Islamic reasons, and where the Islamic critiques of inequality have been either been unavailable or successfully suppressed. Rather than list any recommendations, I want to point out some tough paradoxes that have suppressed what I believe to be the true Islamic egalitarian spirit. The Muslim moneyed class has welcomed neoliberalism, and the religious establishment has gladly embraced a Muslim version of the prosperity gospel. One pundit has even argued that the only way to keep Muslim youth from falling prey to terrorism is to turn them into capitalists. The imperative of even minimal justice and dignity is rudely confronted by the desire for survival or containment of terrorism, and among the faithful for power to preach and missionize. Let me offer a few examples. Modern Turkey is a neoliberal miracle that has used pious wealth to bolster an Islamic democracy to push back against half a century of despotic secular chauvinism. Turkey has also taken a new role as the only power speaking for the masses across the Muslim world. Even before the current wave of political suppression, leftist critics had pointed out the growing inequality in the country, along with the corruption of morals brought by new wealth. Thoughtful Muslims find themselves torn between Islamic objections to neoliberalism and the empowerment of a strong Muslim ally in places like Palestine and Myanmar. In a similar vein, the Saudi Arabian oil wealth has long been interpreted as a sign of divine favor for the true monotheists, the Wahhabis, as a culture of Puritan piety, long concealed in the deep-seated and unjustified inequalities, have long concealed the deep-seated and unjustified inequalities between men and women, tribals and non-tribals, between various tribes and regions, and between Gulf citizens and the rest of Muslims. Religious piety served effectively as a cover for a culture that was becoming deeply bigoted by Islamic standards. It is easy to demonize Saudis, so I will avoid scoring cheap shots. But growing up in Saudi during my high school years, I often wondered why even the enlightened Saudi preachers rarely spoke of the problems of injustice against foreigners and others. My parents' generation of Pakistani expatriates, however, felt extremely loyal and grateful to the Saudi royal class and prayed for the kings for building such stupendous facilities around the two holy mosques. Finally, let us consider the somber fact that the most ardent opposition to social and political justice today comes from a group of clerics associated with Muslim states in the Saudi, UAE, Egypt camp that has been formed against the 2011 Arab uprisings for dignity and justice, and from the very same ulama who wrote strongly worded condemnations of ISIS. Justice, accountability, and rights are dangerous words in much of the Middle East. Its only advocates is the small alliance of countries led by Turkey, the same state that has been empowered by its neoliberal policies, which in turn is the single reason for aggravating inequality throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Anjum. As you can see, the question of equality is far from simple, and you've laid out for us some of the complexities that we'll be facing in our discussions and our learning over these few days. Our second speaker is Father David Hollenbach, Jesuit from Georgetown University. He's the Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown and also a Senior Fellow of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs. David came to Georgetown from Boston College, where he had been for a number of years. He held the Carey and Anne Maguire Chair in Ethics and American History at the John Kluge Center for Scholars at the Library of Congress just before coming to Georgetown. He did his PhD in ethics at Yale University and has published an array of works. David has worked for many years on questions of human rights, and he has taught not only in the US, but in different parts of the world, and particularly in Africa. David.
Thank you very much, Daniel Madigan, a colleague of mine from Georgetown. It is a privilege to be part of the Building Bridges program here, and I would like also to thank Professor Ovamir Anjum for his presentation. My presentation this afternoon will highlight several aspects of the Christian tradition relevant to the inequalities of the world today. And I have divided my presentation into 5 points, just to sketch briefly what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to present a few of the inequalities that mar the world social life today. Second, I will give several reasons why Christians affirm the basic equality of all persons. Third, I'm going to suggest ways that the norm of justice can help us specify when strict equality is required and when some forms of inequality may be acceptable. Fourth, I'm going to argue that Christians in our discussion of this issue must acknowledge that their community, my community, have formally supported forms of inequality that most people regard as morally objectionable today. And finally, in light of that, I'm going to raise the question of how and whether a religious tradition can change and develop in addressing issues of inequality. It seems to me that such a development enabled Christianity, and in particular Roman Catholicism, my own tradition, to move from opposing certain forms of equality that we now regard as required to forms of support for such kinds of equality. And this raises the question of when new developments in a religious tradition may be justified and when the new developments or changes may be problematic. So those are my 5 areas that I want to present. So first, issues of inequality today. Very briefly, there are several forms of inequality that mark our world today, and among these are inequalities of income and wealth. Now, there has been an encouraging decline in the number of people who are living in what is called absolute poverty in the world in recent decades. There has been a notable decline of the number of people living in extreme poverty. Nevertheless, far too many people continue to face severe deprivation, and poverty has declined in some regions of the world more than others. For example, severe poverty is greatest today in sub-Saharan Africa, where somewhere around 390 million people, or about 41% of the entire African population, live in extreme poverty. That's more than the whole rest of the world combined. And overall inequality between countries has declined, but inequalities within countries has been increasing. This is a notable fact. Particular, since 1980, inequality within the countries of North America has been increasing dramatically, especially in my own country, the United States. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton, British and now living in the United States and teaching at Princeton University, shows that an unexpectedly large number of people in the United States live in extreme poverty. And by the way, the definition of extreme poverty here, according to the World Bank, is living on less than $1.90 per day. $1.90 per day in the United States is not enough to buy a cup of coffee in most Starbucks stores. So it's a very real form of poverty. Indeed, in the United States today, in the regions of the Mississippi Delta in southern New Orleans and in the Appalachia region, life expectancy in those regions is lower than it is in Bangladesh, and Vietnam. That's the point I'm trying to indicate about the fact that there's inequality within countries that's quite extraordinarily great. Now, in that distribution of inequality, race is an important factor. Both males and female blacks in the United States have shorter lifespans than do all the people in India's Kerala state. And black males in the United States do not live as long as their brothers in China. Also, another Nobel Prize-winning economist, Amartya Sen, has shown the importance of gender inequalities in our world. Sen has shown that there are about 100 million fewer women alive on Earth today than would have been predicted in the absence of female disadvantages. These millions, these 100 million so-called missing women are missing because of the neglect of nutrition and health care for young females, especially in childhood, or because of selective abortion, where male children are more desired than female children, an extraordinary consequence of gender inequality. In South and East Asia, many young girls receive less food and less health care than do their brothers, and therefore their lives are shorter, accounting for 100 million missing women. A growing body of research also shows that reducing inequalities and overcoming poverty go hand in hand. High inequality undermines sustained economic growth, which in turn makes it more difficult to reduce poverty. In addition, higher initial levels of inequality make it more difficult for poor people to share the benefits brought by economic growth. Inequalities in income have particularly bad effects on education, health care, and social protection. And since low levels of education, health care, and social protection prevent people from contributing to societies in ways that promote growth, there can be a vicious circle in which inequality, poverty, and low growth reinforce each other. So these issues then raise for me the question of what possible contributions Christianity might make to addressing the inequalities we face today. Now, the Christian tradition is strongly supportive of the equality of all persons on a very basic level. The first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, affirms that God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Thus, every human being possesses a sacredness that requires respect and social support. Now, there are, of course, differences in human capacities and different levels of achievement available for different people. But creation in the image and likeness of God confers on each person what can be called basic equality, to borrow a phrase from Jeremy Waldron, a distinguished political philosopher working in the United States. A worth or dignity that demands equal respect despite secondary differences in talents or achievement. Now, this basic equality is reinforced by every person's vocation to union with God for a Christian, a union that they can attain through God's help, through God's grace. Christianity also affirms that despite the failures and sin of human beings, the grace of redemption raises persons to a dignity that transcends even the sacredness of being created in God's own image. Thus, the Second Vatican Council a major important event in my own Roman Catholic tradition, taught that the equal human dignity of all persons flows from the Christian gospel itself and from the heart of Christian faith. These explicitly Christian grounds for basic equality are reinforced by the conviction that the dignity of human persons can be recognized by all human beings and makes claims upon all people, both Christian and not, through the use of human reason and understanding. The Catholic tradition holds that there are reason-based, secular warrants for human dignity and basic equality. Again, quoting the Second Vatican Council, the Council invoked not only the theological theme of the creation of persons in God's image as the foundation of basic equality, but also the Council argued that this basic equality can be seen in the power of the human intellect, the capacity of the human conscience, and in the excellence of human liberty that all persons can recognize in their fellow humans. This opens the way, it seems to me, for Christians to work together with those who are not Christian, including those who are not believers, in the effort to promote greater respect for human dignity on an equal basis. Though all persons are equal on this most basic level, then, it is also clear that not all persons should be treated identically in all domains of activity. Therefore, we need to clarify when basic equality requires treating people the same way and when it may call for treating them differently. Indeed, when it may justify certain kinds of inequality. So my third point about inequality and justice and how it works. Now, Christian thinkers have long recognized that there is a close relationship between the notion of equality and the moral standard of justice. The major Christian theologian of the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, for example, observed, "Justice denotes a kind of equality." Following Aristotle, Aquinas distinguished, however, two types of equality. The first he called arithmetic equality, in which the shares of that which is being distributed are arithmetically or numerically the same for each person receiving a part of the distribution. The image that economists like to use is slicing up a pie or a cake and giving everyone the exactly same size piece of the cake. That's arithmetic equality. Aquinas does not hold, however, that justice requires arithmetical equality in all areas. For example, justice does not require that everyone's income be identical. However, many Christians do hold that arithmetic equality is required in some other spheres of life. The one that comes most readily to mind is the standard one person, one vote that was invoked, for example, in South Africa in the campaign against apartheid, where black people received no vote and white people had disproportionately large power in their political participation. And the campaign led by Nelson Mandela said, no, one person, one vote, a kind of strict arithmetical equality in the distribution of votes. So, on the other hand, in contrast to that notion of arithmetic equality, a second type of equality can be called proportional. As Aquinas put it, there should be a proportion between the thing being distributed and the person to whom it is distributed. This kind of proportional equality is illustrated, for example, by the statement, equal pay for equal work. If one person works twice as many hours as another person does, they shouldn't receive the same wage, their wage should be proportional to the amount of work they did. So the person who works twice as long should receive twice the salary. Similarly, on another criterion, not in terms of how many hours one has worked, but there could be a proportional equality understood in the way health care is distributed, not in terms of income, but proportion to need. We don't say that everyone should get 3.2 operations in the medical care sphere in a lifetime. We don't distribute surgery on an arithmetically equal basis. We distribute surgery in accordance with need. And someone who needs surgical help should receive it in proportion to their need, and similarly, one who does not need it should not receive it in proportion to their lack of need. So there is a proportional equality there. Another example of proportional equality should be the distribution of praise for one's achievements or punishment for one's crimes. We don't give everyone the same amount of time in jail. We distribute jail sentences in proportion to violation of the law. And we distribute medals at the Olympics or perhaps in the World Cup in proportion to performance in the game. So there is a proportion between performance and achievement and reward. So then the question, of course, becomes, what is the appropriate standard for proportionality? And it is here that I would like to highlight, in my fourth point, several areas where I think Christianity has gone wrong in its approach to equality and inequality. I will mention several forms of inequality that are seen as legitimate, that were seen as legitimate by Christians in past decades or past centuries, that are seen as unjust today. And here I am drawing upon the work of a scholar from the United States named John Noonan, a very distinguished historian of Christian moral thought and canon law, who has provided some very interesting studies of the development of Christian thought in a couple of areas, several areas relevant to inequality. On slavery, for example, John Noonan is very blunt. Let me quote him. Noonan says, quote, "As late as 1860, the Catholic Church thought that it was not sinful for a Catholic to own another human being. From St. Paul to St. Augustine to much later, chattel slavery went unchallenged by ecclesiastical authority." This is a form of proportional inequality. Holding another person as a slave was judged acceptable if the other person was a prisoner of war, or if the other person came from a race understood to be incapable of sharing in equal self-governance, and therefore slavery was justified as a form of legitimate proportional inequality. More recently, however, that has changed dramatically within the Christian and Catholic tradition. Noonan puts it this way: "In the light of the teachings of the modern popes and the Second Vatican Council on the dignity of the human person, it is today regarded as morally unthinkable that one person would be allowed to buy, sell, or lease another human being. Slavery has come to be seen as contrary to the creation of all persons in the image and likeness of God." Equality of a proportional type, or inequality of a proportional type, was invoked also to justify limitations on religious freedom within the Christian tradition. One's right to religious freedom was seen as proportional to the truth of one's religious belief. True believers had the right to freedom. Those who believed in something that was judged to be false did not have the right to religious freedom. The way it was put in the 19th and early 20th century in the Roman Catholic tradition, error has no rights. But in John Noonan's time, no later than the time of St. Augustine, it was considered virtuous for bishops to invoke imperial force to compel non-believers to accept Christianity or heretics to return to the church. For over 1,200 years, the vast institutional apparatus of the church was put at the service of detecting heretics who, if they persevered in their heresy or relapsed into it, would be executed at the stake. Thus, as late as 1832, Pope Gregory XVI declared that the right to freedom of conscience is, in his words, craziness. The Latin word he used was deliramentum, a kind of delirium. Gradually, however, the religious wars of post-Reformation Europe and definitively the persecution of Christians by fascist and communist regimes in the 20th century led to a shift in this teaching. The change is evident if one juxtaposes Gregory XVI's condemnation in 1832 of freedom of conscience as craziness with the Second Vatican Council's declaration that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. In other words, the basic equality of all persons and the fact that religious belief is now seen as an essential dimension of human dignity replaced the idea that freedom of religion should be proportional to the truth of one's beliefs. These dramatic shifts give a sobering perspective on aspects of the Christian understanding of the meaning of equality. And they call us to ask, I think, whether further shifts may be called for today, both in Christianity and perhaps in other traditions as well. So my final point then, this raises the question of the possibility and limits of legitimate change in a religious tradition, both in Christianity and perhaps we will discuss in Islam as well in our discussion together over the next few days. This can be approached with the assistance of a great Christian theologian from the late 19th, early 20th century, John Henry Newman, and his book called An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, a book which notes very explicitly how Christian thinking can grow and develop. For Newman, a tradition is not a living tradition if one simply cites classic texts and seeks to apply classic texts from the past. These texts from the past, which we will be reading over the next few days together, are surely central in any tradition that aims to remain intact. But a living tradition, a tradition that is truly alive, must do more than cite texts from the past. It must attend to the way these texts relate to new experiences and to new challenges and situations which may never have been encountered before. Such a challenge was what led Christianity to move from the legitimation of slavery to its recognition that slavery was contrary to a deep reality that was part of the Christian tradition itself. In other words, new experience led to a deepened appreciation of what the tradition itself required. And the same is true about the way Christianity came through new experiences to recognize that its conviction of the importance of its own faith led to the recognition of the right to others from other faiths to be treated with equal respect and equal dignity and equal regard for their religious freedom as well. The examples of slavery and past limits on religious freedom, therefore, show that religious traditions can sometimes have negative effects on the way we approach basic human equality. But fortunately, recent activity by religious communities also shows that faith communities can have very positive impact on the achievement of equality. Religious leaders such as Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the Dalai Lama, Pope John Paul II, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, all of these have played important roles in advancing both justice and equality in our world. The Christian and Catholic communities' recent contributions to human rights and democratic equality have been particularly notable, I think. Catholicism has played an important role in the global advance of democracy since the Second Vatican Council concluded in 1965. For example, beginning in Portugal and Spain in the late 1960s, in numerous countries in Latin America, such as Chile, Brazil, and so forth, in the Philippines, in South Korea in the 1970s and 80s, in the role played by the Church and by Pope John Paul II in Poland, the Catholic community in all of these places has made a very important contribution to the advancement of the equality of human rights for all. And these have made an important contribution. Other religious traditions have also contributed to the advancement of equality and equal rights in some other regions. Islam, for example, has been a leader in certain parts of India, in Indonesia, and in Kuwait on various occasions. The move of Catholicism, then, from its former alignment with authoritarian regimes to the support for democratic equality, this shift was dramatic following the Second Vatican Council, perhaps even revolutionary. It was brought about by the recognition of the dangers of authoritarian regimes, such as Nazism and Stalinism, which threatened the Church's own freedom, but also by a recognition that these threats not only were to the Church's own freedom, but to the freedom and dignity of non-Christians as well. More than the Christians' freedom was at stake in these cases. The experience of multiple kinds of abuse by authoritarian rule led the Second Vatican Council then to endorse the full range of equal human rights for all persons as articulated in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this put the Catholic community into the forefront in the struggle for human rights and democratic equality worldwide. Let me conclude with a very brief word on the Christian tradition's stance on economic implications of human equality, since I began with noting some facts about economic inequality in our world. The Christian tradition, as I noted, does not hold that a flat arithmetic equality of income is required by Christian faith. It does insist, however, that when inequalities lead to the severe deprivation of those at the bottom, when people simply don't have enough to survive, both common respect for the humanity we share across borders and our call as Christians to love our neighbors as ourselves, all this requires us to challenge these inequalities. Indeed, Pope Francis, our current Pope, has called these radical inequalities that deprive those at the bottom the root of all social ills. Pope Francis is very blunt. He says, just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say, thou shalt not, to an economy that excludes and pushes people into severe deprivation. In the words of Pope Francis, such an economy kills. Therefore, thou shalt not kill requires resisting it. Economic inequality that excludes far too many people from their rightful good in the world, in the goods of the world God has created for all people. So to conclude, the Christian tradition, therefore, in my view, supports a strong commitment to the basic equality that requires respect for the dignity of all. It calls for resistance to those forms of inequality that so divide the human community that some people are deprived of what is required for them to live with basic dignity. Basic human equality should override differences among persons when these differences prevent people from obtaining their most basic needs, when they restrict their freedoms without justification, and when they exclude them from important social relations. The Christian community, as I have indicated, has not always lived up to what the central thrust of its tradition requires. The Christian tradition on equality and inequality, however, remains a living tradition. We can hope and expect, therefore, that Christians will continue to gain new insights into what equality requires today. And I hope that our dialogue over the next few days will help us achieve new insight in that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David Ovamir. We're going to open the floor now. It's our custom on these occasions to give preference to the to give preference to our visitors to ask questions, rather than initially to open it to members of the seminar, because they will have opportunities over the next few days. So we offer the floor first to you who are locals. Dr. Cherich. You'll come here? Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, good evening. I cannot but greet my old friends and congratulate to you for your coming here and the continuation, and especially I cannot but mention His Eminence Archbishop Canterbury William for his vision of the building bridges, and also your acceptance to be steward, to take stewardship of after he has retired, because his vision was so great at the time that probably we did not appreciate very much, but we do appreciate now, because we thought after the wall in Berlin we will not have any more walls in the world. Today we don't have only one wall. We have so many walls now, and even in Balkan, even in our country, they are talking that they will build a wall against the immigrants who are coming to Bosnia. So building bridges, and you are a right place here in Bosnia, we have probably more bridges than any country in the world. So, but these bridges, building with the heart, is very important. I was impressed by your lectures. I have been enlightened. I like this idea of justice and equality. Muslims are very much obsessed by justice. Even one theological school is based on tawheed and justice, but theodicy, God's justice, not man's justice. And also Khwarizmi, you know, who invented this algebra, how he come to this idea. One woman came to him to calculate the inheritance of her parents. So he calculated Jabr, put all together on one place, and Muqabala, meaning facing each element equation, and this is how he got to the algebra idea. But also, if I may make my point, human beings don't like equality, and they dislike inequality at the same time. We, as in our nature, is we like to be superior to others, so we don't like equality. But because we don't equality, this is why God has reminded us that we have to change this habit. Now, inequality, in my opinion, is always almost, as a rule, political. There is no sacred book that tells you to treat people in inequality. But politics do this on the basis of power. But how the politics come to the power? By education and manipulation. To tell you, to say just what it means, in the time of slavery, the master of the slave could kill his subject, his slave. He could rape his wife. He could deprive him from his property. He would, with immunity. But if he educate his slave how to write and read, he would be punished. So this tells you that the most dangerous inequality in the world is the lack of the access to education. When people are educated, they will achieve, they will press politics to be equal with others in their basic human rights. And because of that, I think, because common good is an easier theme than this one. This is very difficult, equality. And in order that we fight for justice against equality, we have to fight for the education. And to fight for the right education is to teach people how to rebel against their being treated unequal. And I will give you just example for Muslim tradition, and then I will leave you. The Prophet Muhammad's wife was named Salama. She was married to a man called Abdul Asad. She migrated with the first Muslims to Ethiopia. When she came back to Mecca, her parents didn't allow her to go to Medina, but her husband went. So she insisted to go to Medina with the Prophet, and she was allowed. Her husband was killed in Uhud, the second conflict between the Meccans, and she became without husband. Umar and Abu Bakr Umar offered her to marry her. She declined. And then Prophet said, I will marry you to protect you. She had 4 children. And then when she became part of the Prophet's family, this Abu Salama is an example of rebellion. How? She rebelled against the logic at the time, even the Prophet. She said to him, you know, when you talk about distribution of wealth, you always talk about man. Where are we, women? And then we have the verse in the Quran which says, لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ. There is a portion to man, male, and female as well. This verse is because of her. Now, the second time, she said to the Prophet, you know, when you talk about these immigrants or muhajirin who came to Medina, you always praise the man. Where are we? And then there is a verse in the Quran says, فَاسْتَجَابَ لَهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ أَنِّي لَا أُضِيءُ عَمَلَ عَامِلٍ مِّنكُمْ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ وَأُنْثَى. And then upon this intervention, or rebellion you can say, God has revealed this verse in the Holy Quran saying, God has listened to what she said, and then proclaimed that the female and female are equal, they belong to each other, and that therefore you will. So what is the suggestion here? I will call to Muslim women who feel unequal. I will call all these people, all the Muslims around the world, don't listen what the politicians and kings and others say. Read the Quran and be like Salama. Say, this is wrong. And you will receive. And finally, my professor, mentor, Fazlur Rahman, may God have mercy on him, taught me one thing about the equation or relation between justice and mercy. His very important book, Major Themes of the Quran, which is translated by Anas Karich, is here, very good. He said that Muslims often misuse justice in the sense of being very rigid. And in the name of justice, there are so many wrong things have been done, because justice is according to my justice, my might. So he said justice has the sense only if it is tempered by mercy. So justice tempered by mercy. Now this is really slippery how you to make this, but principally, yes. So listening to you and to your reasons from Muslim and Christian tradition, I am so glad that you are in Sarajevo, and I am very optimistic that what Archbishop Canterbury Williams and myself, I can say, have been doing together, we see the fruits. So one feels very good. Thank you very much for blessing the city of Sarajevo. And we bless you too. Thank you.
Selamun alaikum, and if I knew the way to say hello like a Christian, I would like to say it, since this is the Building Bridges seminar. First of all, I would like to thank you all distinguished scholars. My name is Burcu Cura, and I am following the seminar on behalf of Turkish Embassy as well as my personal interest. I have two questions to Mr. Anjum, and the first one is that you mentioned about some countries at your speech. How did you collect data about the inequality in these countries? And the second one, and this contains a little bit objection, how much do you stress on realpolitik and rational economic structures when you study on inequality? For example, have you ever studied on welfare state concept we have already adopted in Turkey, which depends on equality and meritocracy? Thank you.
Hey, so first question is how I collected my data. So the objection is perhaps based on an interpretation that is not what I offered. My talk was not about offering evidence for inequality in a particular country. but rather on the general observation, which I argue is a consensus in the world of why has, since the 1980s, inequality been aggravated throughout the world, and that is related to neoliberal policies that start with Reagan and Thatcher in 1979, since 1980s. And that's called neoliberalism. And my argument was the paradox that we have seen the improvement of the status of democracy in Turkey on the one hand, yet at the same time this has come as a result of the embrace of neoliberal policies by the democratic Islamic government. Now, there is, as far as I'm aware, the scholarly consensus on neoliberalism is that wherever it goes, it has increased inequality. That is true within the Western countries, within the United States, and across the world. If you were looking for one reference in Turkey, I would point to, in particular reference I made was even earlier, since this is a study published in 2000s by Cihan Tugal, it's called The Passive Revolution, where you can see the state of increasing inequality as a result of neoliberal policies, even though certainly many good things are coming out of it. And remember, what I mentioned this is part of a paradox. And paradox means this isn't a clear good or a clear evil. We have tensions going in two different directions. And so that's my claim. So we see paradox, we see tension. On the one hand, there is some evidence for inequality. On the other hand, improvement of certainly democratic rights. And certainly from a Muslim perspective, Turkey is a strong advocate of causes that concern Muslims greatly, whether it's Palestine or Myanmar and other places. And that, of course, is something that Muslims worldwide, not just in Turkey, are very appreciative of the Turkish government. So that was my point. Did I answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay.
Jack, we're giving preference to the...
They gave me the mic.
Are there any of the other local participants who are... Yes, over there. Sorry.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening. My name is Riyad and I'm a student of economics, and I hope to finish my PhD in this year. And the topic is about wealth inequality. And for last, I can say several years, I deal with the topic of inequality. And to be very frank, my conclusions are that inequality is related to, the topic is about impact of institutional development, in particular financial institutions, in deepening wealth inequality within countries. So the basic idea is to check whether financial development measured by economic measures, variables, do they impact wealth inequality? And my findings is they do. They do. They are significant and important in the determinants of inequality within countries. So I'm Muslim also. So in my perspective, this finding is very important because to me, as I look at this now, even though I'm quite young and I need still to learn a lot, central issue in Islam, at least, are questions of distribution. We have prohibition of interest rate, of riba. So we say that since financial institutions, financial development increases inequality, so we can say that prohibition of interest based on, financial development based on interest rate directly prevents or decreases inequality. It is one thing. Second thing is that we have prohibition of interest. We have zakah. Zakah, which is tax on wealth. It is not small tax. It is about 2.5% of redistributive tax, which is taken from the rich and given to the poor. So, and third is, someone mentioned this redistribution on inheritance law. Of course, everyone who deals with inequality and wealth inequality in particular knows that part of the equation, maybe the most important part of the equation, is inherited wealth. So the best way to become rich is if your parents are rich. So these are three things that are very important. And I was hoping in this conference, and also not only in Islam, interest rate is prohibited also in Christianity, also in Judaism, and also Aristotle said that it is most...
Is there a question to our speakers?
Yeah. The question is very simple. So what's your opinion if Aristotle, if we say that pretty much everything around us is we have from philosophy and from religions, and if philosophy, as Aristotle said, the interest rate is most unnatural way of getting wealth, and if all religion prohibits interest rate or riba or usury, how come it is so omnipresent in our societies? Thank you.
I would just say I agree with your point about institutions being really central. The big question, of course, becomes then, what kind of institutions do we want? We don't want to say we don't want any institutions. We need to find what kind of institutions are the right ones, and in particular, what kind of financial institutions do we need? That means raising questions about what's the role of the free market in the creation of financial agencies, and what's the role of government policy on limitation, on setting limits to what can be done in the financial markets and so forth. So those are big questions, and they're questions that are very much up for debate in the United States right now, as there's a lot of discussion about further deregulation of some of the financial institutions that were created in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008. And the current regime in the United States wants to loosen up those financial institutions. And so I think that really needs to be some very fundamental questions need to be raised there. On the question of interest, that raises a very important question, again, about what kind of interest, how much interest, in what circumstances interest, and so forth. I'm not sure that Christianity has gone through a complex process of evolution in its attitude toward interest. There was a strong condemnation of interest-taking back in the early Middle Ages in Christianity, but it gradually moved toward acknowledgement of the legitimacy of certain forms of interest. But it does not say that a totally unregulated market for interest is legitimate. So how to make the right distinctions, it seems to me, is the most pressing, urgent question in that area. I'm not enough of a specialist on economics and finance in particular to know how to answer that question. But I do know that we need to keep those values of making sure that no one gets so excluded by the way the financial institutions are operating that they have nowhere to go and they have nothing. And we have to find ways of making sure that that does not happen. And that's where the challenge of inequality in our world today, and it's increasing the inequality in the United States, as you mentioned, as it is in Western Europe, precisely because of the freeing up of some of these market institutions that you're referring to as neoliberal. And that needs to be examined with greater care as well. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm basically agreeing with the direction that you're pointing with that, I think.
Thank you very much. So I have, a similar comment, which is very simple. I completely agree with you. I think that usurious interest or interest rate of non-zero has been central to the development of modern capitalism, which is based on creating large inequality, because that inequality actually what we don't recognize, but for some people it's really good, because inequality means some people have a lot, and those people who have a lot, that accumulation of wealth is what has created capitalism, because when you have some people with a lot of wealth, they have money for larger projects to control nature, for instance, in order to produce large technological developments. So, and I completely agree that in fact there is historical data to show for centuries that in Islamic societies you had free market, you had very large free trade throughout the Indian Ocean world, which I referred to in my talk. But you did not have capitalism precisely because you did not have interest. So you could have free market, free economy, and very large sort of global culture, but without the development of enormous inequality, precisely because of the institutions of inheritance and prohibition of usury that you have pointed out.
Thank you. All right, Jack.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your speeches, both of you. My question was for Dr. Hollenbach. When you mentioned the fact that the church had changed its position on freedom of religion and slavery because of the changing circumstances, right? So or do you mean that the kind of changing circumstances, were political or economic, had drawn the attention of the church to teachings or sort of moral material in the scripture that had gone unnoticed or unappreciated, or was it that material and teachings changed over time and that the changing circumstances meant that they had to be implemented differently?
That's a very interesting question. What I'm suggesting is that it's probably both of those happening in some complex blend. On the one hand, new circumstances seeing some of the effects of slavery in new ways, or seeing the effects of the denial of religious freedom, led the Catholic community to recognize that there were aspects of its own deepest tradition that were relevant to addressing these newly perceived effects, let's say, of the denial of religious freedom. Take the question of the treatment of religion by Stalin. And the church had been saying that freedom of religion is a bad idea because it's too individualistic, it's related to the French Revolution, it's highly secularistic in its orientation. But when the church perceived what was going on under Stalin with the repression of religion, it wakened the community to a recognition that some of its deepest beliefs had relevance to the freedom of religion in a new way, to say we don't think that what is happening under Stalin should be done, and therefore we move from saying religious freedom is a danger to Christianity because it's too secularistic and too individualistic, to saying, no, the dignity of the person requires us to stand for the Christian freedom of religion in the Soviet Union and the freedom of religion of others in the Soviet Union who are not Christian. And so there's a recognition that some of the elements of the tradition itself are relevant in new ways because of a new... So it's not saying that we are abandoning the tradition and substituting something different. It's rather a discovery of a new way in which the deeper convictions of the tradition are relevant to new circumstances. I don't know whether that's responding to your question or not, but it's a way of, I mean, what the Second Vatican Council actually said about religious freedom, if you look at the very first few paragraphs, the document says, this sacred synod intends to develop the recent teachings of the Church on freedom of the religion and the constitutional order of society. There's an explicit statement that the documents of the Second Vatican Council, that the Council intends a development. And it's John Courtney Murray, who was one of the authors of the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, said the biggest single issue at the Second Vatican Council about religious freedom was not whether religious freedom was a good idea or not. It was whether there could be a development of doctrine within the Christian Church. Because what happened at Vatican II was actually a shift from saying religious freedom is a bad idea to saying religious freedom is a good idea, which is a development in church doctrine. But it's not a radical development that means abandoning the deepest core of Christian faith. It's saying there's a recognition of a new relevance of Christian faith to circumstances that we had not seen before. So at least that's the way in which I would interpret it. This issue about change and development in Christianity, and it may be true in Islam as well, is a very complicated question. And I'm not doing full justice to it right here, but at least that's the first step in which I would try to respond to your question. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you, David. It's 6 p.m., and that is our time to wind this part of our program up. And there'll be many opportunities over the coming days, and also for the public on Friday afternoon. We hope you will join us at 3 p.m. Here? No, at the Catholic Theology Faculty at 3 p.m. Dr. Church kindly invoked the name of Archbishop Rowan Williams and his developing this process and the importance of that. And I think we should also mention one other name on this occasion, because since 2004, Dr. Jack DeGioia, who's the president of Georgetown, has sustained this process, and when Archbishop Williams retired as Archbishop, he asked Dr. DeGioia if Georgetown would be prepared to sustain the process, because we believe it is a good one and has many years ahead of it, and Jack has done that very generously, and so his is another name that should be held in benediction whenever Building Bridges meets. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to the participants who've flown some distance, who are still catching up on their jet lag. We are having a reception downstairs. You'll be able to see the books from, there are 16 of them there, I think, some of them in galley proofs. The work of, many of them the work of Lucinda Moshe and also of David Marshall, whose name is also held in benediction whenever Building Bridges is mentioned. So a good evening to you all. We hope to thank you to the deans for their welcome to us, their hospitality, and for their presence here today, and also for Father Mato. Thank you all.